don't know how this works. Good evening, hello. We are going to read Gormenghast, which is a trilogy of books published, first of which in 1946 by Mervyn Peake. It is the subject of a BBC television adaptation, which I dearly love and have watched many times, starring the very pretty Jonathan Rhys Meyers, not Jonathan Rhys Davies. Also Christopher Lee, Spike Milligan in one of his last appearances, Celia Imrie. It's a wonderful piece of television. It was also the subject of a BBC radio adaptation, again starring many off-the-shelf BBC character actors who are all very good, and also Sting. And Sting was playing Steerpike, the lead character. Sting's performance was different. The radio adaptation is not good. Anyway, I'm going to start at the beginning and continue until one of us collapses, I suppose. The Hall of the Bright Carvings. Gormenghast, that is, the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of these mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbour, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like a limpet to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken and lofty turrets, and, most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flints. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry, and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. Very little communication passed between the denizens of these outer quarters and those who lived within the walls, save when, on the first June morning of each year, the entire population of the clay dwellings had sanction to enter the grounds in order to display the wooden carvings on which they had been working during the year. These carvings, blazoned in strange colour, were generally of animals or figures, and were treated in a highly stylized manner peculiar to themselves. The competition among them to display the finest object of the year was bitter and rabid, and their sole passion was directed, once their days of love had guttered, on the production of this wooden sculpture. And among the middle of the huts, the foot of the outer wall, existed a score of creative craftsmen, whose position as leading carvers gave them pride of place among the shadows. At one point within the outer wall, a few feet from the earth, the great stones of which the wall itself was constructed jutted forward in the form of a massive shelf stretching from east to west for about 200 to 300 feet. Those protruding stones were painted white, and it was upon this shelf that on the first morning of June the carvings were ranged every year for judgment by the Earl of Groan. Those works, judged to be the most consummate, and there were never more than 3 chosen, were subsequently relegated the Hall of the Bright Carvings. Standing immobile throughout the day, these vivid objects, with their fantastic shadows on the wall behind them, shifting and elongating hour by hour with the sun's rotation, exuded a kind of darkness for all their colour. The air between them was turgid with contempt and jealousy. The craftsmen stood about like beggars, their families clustered in silent groups. They were uncouth and prematurely aged, all radiance gone. The carvings that were left unselected were burned the same evening in the courtyard below Lord Groan's western balcony, and it was customary for him to stand there at the time of the burning and to bow his head silently as if in pain, and then to beat a gong thrice from within. The 3 carvings, to escape the flames, would be brought forth in the moonlight. They were stood upon the balustrade of the balcony in full view of the crowd below, and the Earl of Groan would call for their authors to come forward. When they had stationed themselves immediately beneath where he was standing, the Earl would throw down to them the traditional scrolls of vellum, which, as the writings upon them verified, permitted these men to walk the battlements above their cantonment at the full moon of each alternate month. On these particular nights, from a window in the southern wall of Gormenghast, an observer might watch the minute moonlit figures whose skill had won for them this honour which they so coveted, moving to and fro among the battlements. Saving this exception of the day of carvings, and the latitude permitted to the most peerless, there was no other opportunity for those who lived within the walls to know of these outer folk, nor in fact were they of interest to the inner world, being submerged within the shadows of the great walls. They were all but forgotten people, the breed that was remembered with a start, or with the unreality of a recrudescent dream. The day of carvings alone brought them into the sunlight and reawakened the memory of former times. For as far back as even Nettle, the octogenarian who lived in the tower above the rusting armoury, could remember, the ceremony had been held. Innumerable carvings had smouldered to ashes in obedience to the law, but the choicest were still housed in the Hall of the Bright Carvings. This hall, which ran along the top story of the north wing, was presided over by the curator, Rotcott, who, as no one ever visited the room, slept during most of his life in the hammock he had erected at the far end. For all his dozing, he had never been known to relinquish the feather duster from his grasp, the duster with which he would perform one of the only 2 regular tasks which appeared to be necessary in that long and silent hall, namely, to flick the dust from the bright carvings. As objects of beauty, these works held little interest to him, and yet in spite of himself he had become attached in a propinquital way to a few of the carvings. He would be more than thorough when dusting the emerald horse. The black and olive head which faced it across the boards and the piebald shark were also his especial care. Not that there was any on which the dust was allowed to settle. Entering at 7 o'clock, winter and summer, year in, year out, Rotcott would disengage himself of his jacket and draw over his head a long grey overall which descended shapelessly to his ankles. With his feather duster tucked beneath his arm, it was his habit to peer sagaciously over his glasses down the length of the hall. His skull was dark and small like a corroded musket bullet, and his eyes, behind the gleaming of his glasses, were the twin miniatures of his head. All 3 were constantly on the move, as though to make up for the time they spent asleep, their head wobbling in a mechanical way from side to side when Mr. Rotcott walked, and the eyes, as though taking their cue from the parent sphere to which they were attached, peering here, there, and everywhere at nothing in particular. Having peered quickly over his glasses on entering, and having repeated the performance along the length of the north wing after enveloping himself in his overall, it was the custom of Rotcott to relieve his left armpit of the feather duster, and with that weapon raised, to advance towards the first of the carvings on his right-hand side without more ado. Being on the top floor of the north wing, this hall was not in any real sense a hall at all, but was more in the nature of a loft. The only window was at its far end, and opposite the door through which Rotcod would enter from the upper body of the building. It gave little light. The shutters were invariably lowered. The hall of the bright carvings was illumined night and day by 7 great candelabra, suspended from the ceiling at intervals of 9 feet. The candles were never allowed to fail, or even to gutter, Rotcod himself seeing to their replenishment before retiring at 9 o'clock in the evening. There was a stock of white candles in the small dark anteroom beyond the door of the hall, where also were kept ready for use Rotcod's overall, a huge visitor's book, white with dust, and a stepladder. There were no chairs or tables, nor indeed any furniture save the hammock at the window end where Mr. Rotcod slept. The boarded floor was white with dust, which, so assiduously kept from the carvings, had no alternative resting place, and had collected deep and ash-like, accumulating especially in the 4 corners of the hall. Having flicked at the first carving on his right, Rotcod would move mechanically down the long phalanx of colour, standing a moment before each carving, his eyes running up and down it and all over it, and his head wobbling knowingly on his neck, before he introduced his feather duster. Rotcod was unmarried. An aloofness and even a nervousness was apparent on first acquaintance, and the ladies held a particular horror for him. His then was an ideal existence, living alone day and night in a long loft. Yet occasionally, for one reason or another, a servant or a member of the household would make an unexpected appearance and startle him with some question appertaining to the ritual, and then the dust would settle once more in the hall and on the soul of Mr. Rotcod. What were his reveries as he lay in his hammock, with his dark bullet head tucked in the crook of his arm? What would he be dreaming of, hour after hour, year after year? It is not easy to feel that any great thoughts haunted his mind, nor, in spite of the sculpture whose bright files surged over the dust in narrowing perspective, like the highway for an emperor, that Rotcod made any attempt to avail himself of his isolation, but rather that he was enjoying the solitude for its own sake, with, at the back of his mind, the dread of an intruder. One humid afternoon, a visitor did arrive to disturb Rotcod as he lay deeply hammocked, for his siesta was broken sharply by the rattling of a door handle, which was apparently performed in lieu of the more popular practice of knocking at the panels. The sound echoed down the long room, and then settled into a fine dust on the boarded floor. The sunlight squeezed itself between the thin cracks of the window blind. Even on a hot, stifling, unhealthy afternoon such as this, the blinds were down, and the candlelight filled the room with an incongruous radiance. At the sound of the door-handle being rattled, Rotcod sat up suddenly. The thin bands of moted light, edging their way through the shutters, barred his dark head with the brilliance of the outer world. As he lowered himself over the hammock, it wobbled on his shoulders, and his eyes darted up and down the door, returning again and again, after their rapid and precipitous journeys, to the agitations of the door-handle. Gripping his feather duster in his right hand, Rotcod began to advance down the bright avenue, his feet giving rise at each step to little clouds of dust. When he had at last reached the door, the handle had ceased to vibrate. Lowering himself suddenly to his knees, he placed his right eye at the keyhole, and controlling the oscillation of his head and vagaries of his left eye, which was forever trying to dash up and down the vertical surface of the door, he was able, by dint of concentration, to observe, within 3 inches of his keyhole an eye which was not his, being not only of a different colour to his own iron marble, but being, which is more convincing, on the other side of the door. This third eye, which was going through the same performance as the one belonging to Hrothgar, belonged to Flay, the taciturn servant of Sepulcrave, Earl of Gormenghast. For Flay to be 4 rooms horizontally, or 1 floor vertically, away from his lordship, was a rare enough thing in the castle. For him to be absent at all from his master's side was abnormal, yet here, apparently on this stifling summer afternoon, was the eye of Mr. Flay at the outer keyhole of the Hall of the Bright Carvings, and presumably the rest of Mr. Flay was joined on behind it. On mutual recognition, the eyes withdrew simultaneously, and the brass doorknob rattled again in the grip of his visitor's hand. Hrothgar turned the key in the lock, and the door opened slowly. Mr. Flay appeared to clutter up the doorway as he stood revealed, his arms folded, surveying the smaller man before him in an expressionless way. It did not look as though such a bony face could give normal utterance, but rather that instead of sound something more brittle, more ancient, something drier would emerge, something perhaps more in the nature of a splinter or a fragment of stone. Nevertheless, the harsh lips parted. "It's me," he said, and took a step forward into the room, his knee joints cracking as he did so. His passage across a room, in fact his passage through life, was accompanied by these cracking sounds, 1 per step, which might be likened to the breaking of dried twigs. Hrothgar, seeing that it was indeed he, motioned him to advance by an irritable gesture of the hand, and closed the door behind him. Conversation was never one of Mr. Flay's accomplishments, and for some time he gazed mercilessly ahead of him. And then, after what seemed an eternity to Hrothgar, he raised a bony hand and scratched himself behind the ear. Then he made his second remark. "Still here, eh?" he said, his voice forcing its way out of his face. Hrothgar, feeling presumably that there was little need to answer such a question, shrugged his shoulders and gave his eyes the run of the ceiling. Mr. Flay pulled himself together and continued, "I said still here, eh? Hrothgar." He stared bitterly at the carving of the emerald horse. "You're still here, eh?" "I am invariably here," said Hrothgar, lowering his gleaming glasses and running his eyes all over Mr. Flay's visage. "Day in, day out. Invariably. Very hot weather, extremely stifling. Did you want anything?" "Nothing," said Flay, and he turned towards Hrothgar with something menacing in his attitude. "I want nothing." He wiped the palms of his hands on his hips where the dark cloth shone like silk. Hrothgar flicked ash from his shoes with a feather duster and tilted his bullet head. "Ah," he said in a non-committal way. "You say, ah," said Flay, turning his back on Hrothgar and beginning to walk down the coloured avenue. "But I tell you it's more than ah." "Of course," said Hrothgar, "much more, I dare say, but I fail to understand. I am a curator." At this he drew his body up to his full height and stood on the tips of his toes in the dust. "A what?" said Flay, struggling above him, for he had returned. "A curator?" "That is so," said Hrothgar, shaking his head. Flay made a hard noise in his throat. To Hrothgar it signified a complete lack of understanding, and it annoyed him that the man should invade his province. "Curator," said Flay, after a ghastly silence. "I'll tell you something. I know something, eh?" "Well," said Hrothgar, "I'll tell you," said Flay. "But first, what day is it? What month and what year is it? Answer me." Hrothgar was puzzled at this question, but he was becoming a little intrigued. It was so obvious that the bony man had something on his mind, and he replied, "It is the 8th day of the 8th month. I'm uncertain about the year, but why?" In a voice almost inaudible, Flay repeated, "The 8th day of the 8th month." His eyes were almost transparent, as though in a country of ugly hills one were to find among the harsh rocks 2 sky-reflecting lakes. "Come here," he said. "Come closer, Rotcod. I'll tell you. You don't understand Gormenghast. What happens in Gormenghast. The things that happen. No. Below you. That's where it all is, under this north wing. What are these things up here, these wooden things? No use now. Keep them, but no use now. Everything is moving. The castle is moving. Today, first time for years, he's alone. His lordship. Not in my sight. Flay picked at his knuckle. Bedchamber of ladyship. That's where he is. Lordship. Beside himself. Won't have me. Won't let me in to see the new one. The new one. He's come. He's downstairs. I haven't seen him. Flay bit at the corresponding knuckle on the other hand, as though to balance the sensation. No one's been in. Of course not. I'll be next. Birds lined along the bed rail. Ravens, starlings, all the perishes. And the white rook. There's a kestrel. Claws through pillow. My lady feeds them crusts, grain and crusts. Hardly seen her newborn. Heir to Gormenghast. Doesn't look at him. But my lord keeps staring. Seen him through the grating. Needs me. Won't let me in. Are you listening? Mr. Rotcod was certainly listening. In the first place, he had never heard Mr. Flay talk so much in his life before. And in the second place, the news that his son had been born at long last to the ancient and historic house of Groan was, after all, an interesting titbit for a curator living alone on the upper story of the desolate north wing. Here was something with which he could occupy his mind for some time to come. It was true, as Mr. Flay pointed out, that he, Rotcod, could not possibly feel the pulse of the castle as he lay in his hammock. For in point of fact, Rotcod had not even suspected that an heir was on his way. His meals came up in a miniature lift through darkness from the servants' quarters, many floors below, and he slept in the ante-room at night. Consequently, he was completely cut off from the world and all its happenings. Flay had brought him real news. All the same, he disliked being disturbed, even when information of this magnitude was brought. What was passing through the bullet-shaped head was a question concerning Mr. Flay's entry. Why had Flay, who never in the normal course of events would have raised an eyebrow to acknowledge his presence, why had he now gone to the trouble of climbing to a part of the castle so foreign to him, and to force a conversation on a personality so unexpansive as his own? He ran his eyes over Mr. Flay in his peculiar rapid way, and surprised himself by saying suddenly, "To what may I attribute your presence, Mr. Flay?" "What?" said Flay. What's that?" He looked down on Rotcod, and his eyes became glassy. In truth, Mr. Flay had surprised himself. Why, indeed, he thought to himself, had he troubled to tell Rotcod the news which meant so much to him? Why Rotcod, of all people? He continued staring at the curator for some while, and the more he stood and pondered, the clearer it became to him that the question he had been asked was, to say the very least, uncomfortably pertinent. The little man in front of him had asked a simple and forthright question. It had been rather a poser. He took a couple of shambling steps towards Mr. Rotcod, and then, forcing his hands into his trouser pockets, turned round very slowly on one heel. "Ah," he said at last, "I see what you mean, Rotcod. I see what you mean." Rotcod was longing to get back to his hammock and enjoy the luxury of being quite alone again, but his eye travelled even more speedily towards the visitor's face when he heard the remark. Mr. Flay said he had saw what Rotcod had meant. Had he really? Very interesting. What, by the way, had he meant? What precisely was it Mr. Flay had seen? He flicked an imaginary speck of dust from the gilded head of a dryad. "You are interested in the birth below?" he inquired. Flay stood for a while as though he had heard nothing. And after a few minutes, it was obvious that he was thunderstruck. "Interested," he cried in a deep, husky voice. "Interested? The child is a grown. Authentic male grown. Challenge to change. No change, Rodcott. No change." "Ah," said Rodcott, I see your point, Mr. Flay. But his lordship was not dying?" "No," said Mr. Flay, "not dying, but teeth lengthen." And he strode to the wooden shutters with long, slow, heron-like paces, and the dust rose behind him. When it had settled, Rodcott could see his angular parchment-coloured head leaning itself against the lintel of the window. Mr. Flay could not feel entirely satisfied with his answer to Rodcott's question covering the reason for his appearance in the Hall of the Bright Carvings. As he stood there by the window, the question repeated itself to him again and again. Why, Rodcott? Why on earth, Rodcott? And yet he knew that directly he had heard of the birth of the heir, when his dour nature had been stirred so violently that he found himself itching to communicate his enthusiasm to another being, from that moment Rodcott had leapt to his mind. Never of a communicative or enthusiastic nature, he had found it difficult, even under the emotional stress of the Advent, to inform Rodcott of the facts. And as has been remarked, he had surprised even himself, not only for having unburdened himself at all, but having done so in so short a time. He turned and saw the curator was standing wearily by the piebald shark, his small, cropped round head moving to and fro like a bird's, and his hands clasped before him with a feather duster between his fingers. He could see that Rodcott was politely waiting for him to go, although Mr. Flay was in a peculiar state of mind. He was surprised at Rodcott for being so unimpressed at the news. He was surprised at himself for having brought it. He took from his pocket a vast watch of silver and held it horizontally on the flat of his palm. "Must go," he said awkwardly. "Hear me, Rodcott? I must go." "Good of you to call," said Rodcott. "Will you sign your name in the visitor's book as you go out?" "No, not a visitor." Flay brought his shoulders up to the ears. "Been with lordship 37 years. Sign a book," he said contemptuously, and spat into the far corner of the room. "As you wish," said Rodcott. "It was to the section of the visitor's book devoted to the staff that I was referring." "No," said Flay. As he passed the curator on his way to the door, he looked carefully at him as he came abreast, and the question rankled. Why? The castle was filled with the excitement of the nativity. All was alive with conjecture. There was no control. Rumour swept through the stronghold. Everywhere, in passage, in archway, cloister, refectory, kitchen, dormitory, and hall, it was all the same. Why had he chosen the unenthusiastic Rodcott? And then in a flash he realised. He must have subconsciously known that the news would be new to no one else. The Rodcott was virgin soil for his message. Rodcott, the curator, who lived alone among the bright carvings, was the only one on whom he could vent the tidings without jeopardizing his sullen dignity, and to whom, although the knowledge would give rise to but little enthusiasm, it would at least be new. Having solved the problem in his mind, and having realised in a dullish way that the conclusion was particularly mundane and uninspired, and that there was no question of his soul calling along the corridors and up the stairs to the soul of Rodcott, Mr. Flay, in a thin, straddling manner, moved along the passages of the north wing, and down the curve of stone steps that led to the stone quadrangle, feeling a curious disillusion, a sense of having suffered a loss of dignity, and a feeling of being thankful that his visit to Rodcott had been unobserved, and that Rotcod himself was well hidden from the world in the hall of the bright carvings. The great kitchen. As Flay passed through the servants' archway and descended the 12 steps that led into the main corridor of the kitchen quarters, he became aware of an acute transformation of mood. The solitude of Mr. Rotcod's sanctum, which had been lingering in his mind, was violated. Here, among the stone passages, were all the symptoms of ribald excitement. Mr. Flay hunched his bony shoulders, and with his hands in his jacket pockets dragged them to the front, so that only the black cloth divided his clenched fists. The material was stretched as though it would split at the small of his back. He stared mirthlessly right and left, and then advanced, his long spidery legs cracking as he shouldered his way through a heaving group of menials. They were guffawing to each other coarsely, and one of them, evidently the wit, was contorting his face, as pliable as putty, into shapes that appeared to be independent of the skull, if indeed he had a skull beneath that elastic flesh. Mr. Flay pushed past. The corridor was alive. Clusters of aproned figures mixed and disengaged. Some were singing, some were arguing, and some draped against the wall quite silent from exhaustion, their hands dangling from their wrists or flapping stupidly to the beat of some kitchen catch song. The clamour was pitiless. Technically this was more the spirit Mr. Flay liked to see, or at all events thought to be more appropriate to the occasion. Rotcod's lack of enthusiasm had shocked him, and here, at any rate, the traditional observance of felicity at the birth of an heir to Gormenghast was being observed. But it would have been impossible for him to show any signs of enthusiasm himself when surrounded by it in others. As he moved along the crowded corridor and passed in turn the dark passages that led to the slaughterhouse, with its stench of fresh blood, the bakeries with their sweet loaves, and the stairs that led down to the wine vaults and the underground network of the castle cellars, he felt a certain satisfaction at seeing how many of the roisterers staggered aside to let him pass, for his station as retainer-in-chief to his lordship was commanding, and his sour mouth and the frown that had made a permanent nest upon his jutting forehead were a warning. It was not often that Flay approved of happiness in others. He saw in happiness the seeds of independence, and in independence the seeds of revolt. But on an occasion such as this, it was different, for the spirit of convention was being rigorously adhered to, and in between his ribs Mr. Flay experienced twinges of pleasure. He had come to where, on his left and halfway along the servants' corridor, the heavy wooden doors of the great kitchen stood ajar. Ahead of him, narrowing in dark perspective, for there were no windows, the rest of the corridor stretched silently away. It had no doors on either side, and at the far end it was terminated by a wall of flints. This useless passage was, as might be supposed, usually deserted. But Mr. Flay noticed that several figures were lying stretched in the shadows. At the same time he was momentarily deafened by a great bellowing, clattering, and stamping. As Mr. Flay entered the great kitchen, the steaming, airless concentration of a ghastly heat struck him. He felt that his body had received a blow. Not only was the normal, sickening atmosphere of the kitchen augmented by the sun's rays streaming into the room at various points through the high windows, but in the riot of the festivities the fires had been banked dangerously. But Mr. Flay realized that it was right that it should be as insufferable as it was. He was even realizing the 4 guerrillas who were forcing joint after joint between the metal doors with their clumsy boots until the oven began to give under the immoderate strain, were in key with the legitimate temper of the occasion. The fact that they had no idea what they were doing, nor why they were doing it, was irrelevant. The Countess had given birth. Was this a moment for rational behaviour? The walls of the vast room were streaming with callid moisture. They were built with grey slabs of stone, and were the personal concern of a company of 18 men, known as the Grey Scrubbers. It had been their privilege, on reaching adolescence, to discover that, being the sons of their fathers, their careers had been arranged for them, and stretching ahead of them lay their identical lives, consisting of an unimaginative, if praiseworthy, duty. This was to restore each... Hello, we're back. This was to restore each morning to the great grey floor and lofty walls of the kitchen a stainless complexion. On every day of the year, from 3 hours before daybreak until about 11 o'clock, when the scaffolding and ladders became a hindrance to the cooks, the Grey Scrubbers fulfilled their hereditary calling. Through the character of their trade, their arms had become unusually powerful, and when they let their huge hands hang loosely at their sides, there was more than an echo of the Simeon. Coarse as these men appeared, they were an integral part of the kitchen. Without the Grey Scrubbers, something very earthy, very heavy, very real would be missing to any sociologist searching in that steaming room for a completion of the circle of temperaments, a gamut of the lower human values. Through daily proximity to the great slabs of stone, the faces of the Grey Scrubbers had become slab-like themselves. There was no expression whatever upon their 18 faces, unless the lack of expression is in itself an expression. They were simply slabs that the Grey Scrubbers spoke from occasionally, stared from incessantly, heard with hardly ever. They were traditionally deaf. The eyes were there, small and flat as coins, and the colour of the walls themselves, as though during the long hours of professional staring, the grey stone had at last reflected itself indelibly, once and for all. Yes, the eyes were there, 36 of them, and 18 noses were there, the lines of the mouths that resembled the harsh cracks that divided the stone slabs, they were there too. Although nothing physical was missing from any one of their 18 faces, yet it would be impossible to perceive the faintest sign of animation. And even if a basin full of their features had been shaken together, and if each feature had been picked out at random and stuck upon some dummy head of wax at any capricious spot or angle, it would have made no difference, for even the most fantastic, most ingenious of arrangements could not have tempted into life a design whose component parts were dead. In all, counting the ears, which on occasion may be monstrously expressive, the 108 features were unable at the best of times to muster between them, individually or taken en masse, the faintest shadow of anything that might hint at the workings of what lay beneath. Having watched the excitement developing around them in the great kitchen, and unable to comprehend what it was all about for lack of hearing, they had up to the last hour or two been unable to enter into that festive spirit which had attacked the very heart and bowels of the kitchen staff. But here and now, on this day of days, cognizant at last of the arrival of the new lord, the 18 Grey Scrubbers were lying side by side upon their flagstones, beneath a great table, dead drunk to a man. They had done honour to the occasion, and were out of the picture, having been rolled under the table like so many barrels of ale, as indeed they were. Through the clamour of the voices in the great kitchen that rose and fell, that changed tempo and lingered, until a strident rush or a wheezy slide of sound came to a new pause, only to be shattered by a hideous croak of laughter or a thrilled whisper, or a clearing of some coarse throat. Through all this thick and interwoven skein of bedlam, the ponderous snoring of the Grey Scrubbers had continued as a recognisable theme of dolorous persistence. In favour of the Grey Scrubbers, it must be said that it was not until the walls and floor of the kitchen were shining from their exertions that they attacked the bungs as though unweaned. But it was not only they who had succumbed. The same unquestionable proof of loyalty could be observed in no less than 40 members of the kitchen who, like the Grey Scrubbers, recognising the bottle as the true medium through which to externalise their affection for the family of grown, were seeing visions and dreaming dreams. Mr. Flay, wiping away with the back of his claw-like hand the perspiration that had already gathered on his brow, allowed his eyes to remain a moment on the inert and foreshortened bodies of the inebriate grey scrubbers. Their heads were towards him, cropped to a gun-grey stubble. Beneath the table a shadow had roosted, and the rest of their bodies, receding in parallel lines, were soon devoured in the darkness. At first glance he had been reminded of nothing so much as a row of curled-up hedgehogs, and it was some time before he realized that he was regarding a line of prickly skulls. When he had satisfied himself on this point, his eyes travelled sourly around the great kitchen. Everything was confusion. But behind the flux of shifting figures and the temporary chaos of overturned mixing bowls, of the floor littered with stockpots, basting pans, broken bowls and dishes, and oddments of food, Mr. Flay could see the main fixtures in the room, and keep then in his mind as a means of reference, for the kitchen swam before his eyes in a clammy mist. Divided by the heavy stone wall, in which was situated a hatch of strong timber, was the garde-manger, with its stacks of cold meat, and running and hanging carcasses, and on the inside of the wall the spit. On a fixed table running along a length of wall were huge bowls capable of holding 50 portions. The stockpots were perpetually simmering, having boiled over, and the floor about them was a mess of sepia fluid and eggshells that had been floating in the pots for the purpose of clearing the soup. The sawdust that was spread neatly over the floor each morning was by now kicked into heaps and soaked in the splashings of wine, and where scattered about the floor little blobs of fat had been rolled or trodden in, the sawdust stuck to them, giving them the appearance of rissoles. Hanging along the dripping walls were rows of sticking knives and steels, boning knives, skinning knives, two-handed cleavers, and beneath them a 12-foot by 9-foot chopping block, cross-hatched and hollowed by decades of long wounds. On the other side of the room, to Mr. Flay's left, a capacious, enormous copper, a row of ovens, a narrow doorway, acted as his landmarks. The doors of the ovens were flying wide, and acid flames were leaping dangerously, as the fats that had been thrown into the fires bubbled and stank. Mr. Flay was in two minds. He hated what he saw. For all of the rooms in the castle, it was the kitchen he detested the most, and for a very real reason. And yet a thrill in his scarecrow body made him aware of how right it all was. He could not, of course, analyse his feelings, nor would the idea have occurred to him. But he was so much a part and parcel of Gormenghast that he could instinctively tell when the essence of his tradition was running in a true channel, powerfully, with no deviation. But the fact that Mr. Flay appreciated, as from the profoundest of motives, the vulgarity of the great kitchen, in no way mitigated his contempt for the figures he saw before him as individuals. As he looked from one to the other, the satisfaction which he had at first experienced in seeing them collectively gave way to a detestation as he observed them piecemeal. A prodigious twisted beam, warped into a spiral, floated, or so it seemed in the haze, across the breadth of the great kitchen. Here and there along its undersurface, iron hooks were screwed into its grain. Slung over it like sacks half filled with sawdust, so absolutely lifeless they appeared, were 2 pastry cooks, an ancient poissonnier, a rôtier with legs so bandy as to describe a rugged circle, a red-headed legumier, and 5 sauciers, with their green scarves round their necks. One of them, near the far end from where Flay stood, twitched a little, but apart from this, all was stillness. They were very happy. Mr. Flay took a few paces, and the atmosphere closed around him. He had stood by the door unobserved, but now, as he came forward, a roisterer, leaping suddenly in the air, caught hold of one of the hooks in the dark beam above them. He was suspended by one arm, a cretinous little man with a face of concentrated impudence. He must have possessed a strength out of all proportions to his size, for with the weight of his body hanging on the end of one arm, he yet drew himself up so that his head reached the level of the iron hook. As Mr. Flay passed beneath, the dwarf, twisting himself upside down with incredible speed, coiled his legs around the twisted beam and dropped the rest of himself vertically, with his face a few inches from that of Mr. Flay, and grinned at him grotesquely with his head upside down, before Flay could do anything save come to an abrupt halt. The dwarf had then swung himself onto the beam again and was running along it in all fours with an agility more likely to be found in jungles than kitchens. A prodigious bellow, outvoicing all cacophony, caused him to turn his head away from the dwarf. Away to his left, in the shade of a supporting pillar, he could make out the vague, unmistakable shape of what had really been at the back of his brain like a tumour, ever since he entered the great kitchen. Swelter. The chef of Gormenghast, balancing his body with difficulty upon a cask of wine, was addressing a group of apprentices in their striped and sodden jackets and small white caps. They clasped each other's shoulders for support. Their adolescent faces, streaming with the heat of the adjacent ovens, were quite stupefied. And when they laughed or applauded the enormity above them, it was with a crazed and sycophantic fervour. As Mr. Flay approached to within a few yards of the cluster, another roar, such as he had heard a moment or two earlier, rolled into the heat above the wine barrel. The young scullions had heard this roar many times before, but had never heard it associated with anything other than anger. At first, consequently, it had frightened them, but they'd soon perceived that there was no irritation in its note today. The chef, as he loomed above them, drunken, arrogant and pedantic, was enjoying himself. As the apprentices swayed tipsily around the wine cask, their faces catching and losing the light that streamed through a high window, they also, in a delirious fashion, were enjoying themselves. The echoes died from the apparently reasonless bellow of the chief chef, and the sagging circle above the barrel stamped its feet feverishly, and gave high, shrill cries of delight, for they had never seen such an inane smile evolving from the blur of the huge head above them. Never before had they enjoyed such latitude in the presence of the chef. They struggled to outdo one another in taking liberties unheard of hitherto. They vied for favours, screaming his name at the top of their voices. They tried to catch his eye. They were very tired, very heavy, sick with the drink and the heat, but were living fiercely on their fuddled reserves of nervous energy. All saving one high-shouldered boy, who throughout the scene had preserved a moody silence. He loathed the figure above him, and despised his fellow apprentices. He leaned against the shadowy side of the pillar, out of the chef's line of vision. Mr. Flay was annoyed, even on such a day, by the scene. Although approving in theory and practice, it seemed to him that the spectacle was unpleasant. He remembered when he had first come across Swelter, how he and the chef had instantaneously entered a mutual dislike, and how this antipathy had festered. To Swelter, it was irksome to see the bony, straggly figure of Lord Sepulchreve's first servant in his kitchen at all, the only palliative to this annoyance being the opportunity which it afforded for the display of his superior wit at Mr. Flay's expense. Mr. Flay entered Mr. Swelter's streaming province for one purpose only, to prove to himself as much as to others that he, as Lord Groan's personal attendant, would on no account be intimidated by any member of staff. To keep this fact well in front of his own mind, He made a tour of the servants' quarters every so often, never entering the kitchen, however, without a queasiness of stomach, never departing from it without a renewal of spleen. The long beams of sunlight, which were reflected from the moist walls in a shimmering haze, had pranked the chef's body with blotches of ghost light. The effect from below was that of a dappled volume of warm, vague whiteness, and of a grey that dissolved into swamps of midnight, of a volume that towered and dissolved among the rafters. As occasion merited, he supported himself against the stone pillar at his side, and as he did so the patches of light shifted across the degraded whiteness of the stretched uniform he wore. When Mr. Flay had first eyed him, the cook's head had been entirely in shadow. Upon it the tall cap of office rose coldly, a vague topsail half lost in a fitful sky. In the total effect there was indeed something of the galleon. One of the blotches of sunlight reflected swayed to and fro across the paunch. This particular pool of light, moving in a mesmeric manner backwards and forwards, picked out from time to time a long red island spill of wine. It seemed to leap forward from the mottled cloth when the light fastened upon it, in startling contrast to the chiaroscuro, and to defy the laws of tone. This ungarnished sign of Swelter's debauch, taking the swollen curve of the linen, had somehow, to Mr. Flay's surprise, a fascination. For a minute he watched it appear and disappear, to reappear again, a lozenge of crimson as the body behind it swayed. Another senseless bout of foot-stamping and screaming broke the spell, and lifting his eyes, he scowled about him. Suddenly, for a moment, the memory of Mr. Rotgard in his dusty, deserted hall stole into his consciousness, and he was shocked to realize how much he had really preferred to this inferno of time-hallowed revelry the limp and seemingly disloyal self-sufficiency of the curator. He straddled his way to a vantage point, from where he could see and remain unseen, and from there he noticed that Swelter was steadying himself on his legs, and with a huge, soft hand making signs to the adolescents below him to hold their voices. Flay noticed how the habitual truculence of his tone and manner had today altered to something mealy, a conviviality weighted with lead and sugar, a ghastly intimacy, more dreadful than his most dreaded rages. His voice came down from the shadows in huge wads of sound, like the warm, sick notes of some prodigious mouldering ball of felt. His soft hand silenced the seething of the apprentices, and he allowed his thick voice to drop out of his face. Gallstones! And then in the dimness he flung his arms apart so that the buttons of his tunic were torn away, one of them whizzing across the room and stunning a cockroach on the opposite wall. Close your ranks, and close your ranks, and listen most attentivesome. Come closer then, my little sea of faces. Come closer in, my little ones. The apprentices edged themselves forward, tripping and treading upon each other's feet, the foremost of them being wedged against the wine-barrel itself. That's the way, that's just the way, said Swelter, leering down at them. Now, we're quite a happy little family, most select and advanced. He slid a fat hand through a slit in his white garment of office, and removed from a deep pocket a bottle, plucking out the cork with his lips that had gripped it with an uncanny muscularity. He poured half a pint down his throat without displacing the cork, for he laid a finger at the mouth of his bottle, so dividing the rush of wine into two separate spurts that shot adroitly into either cheek, and so making contact in the back of his mouth down his throat in one dull gurgle to those unmentionable gulches that lay below. The apprentices screamed and stamped and tore at each other in an access of delight and admiration. The chef removed the cork, twisted it around between his thumb and forefinger, and satisfying himself that it had remained perfectly dry during the operation, recorked the bottle and returned it through the slit in his pocket. Again he put up his hand, and silence was restored, save for the heavy, excited breathing. "Now tell me this, my stenching cherubs. Tell me this, and extra quickly. Who am I? Now tell me, extra quickly." "Swelter!" they cried. "Swelter, sir! Swelter!" "Is that all you know?" came the voice. "Is that all you know, my little sea of faces? Silence now, and listen well to me, chief chef of Gormenghast, man and boy, 40 years, fair and foul, rain or shine, sand and sawdust, eggs and stags and all the rest of them done to a turn and spread with a sauce of aloes and a dash of prickling pepper." "With a dash of prickling pepper," yelled the apprentices, hugging themselves and each other in turn. "Shall we cook it, sir?" "We'll do it now, sir. Slosh it up in the copper, sir. Stir it up. Oh, what a tasty dish, sir. What a tasty dish." "Silence!" roared the chef. "Silence, my fairy boys. Silence, my belching angels. Come closer here. Closer with your creamy little faces. I'll tell you who I am." The high-shouldered boy, who had taken no part in the excitement, pulled out a small pipe of knotted wormwood and filled it deliberately. His mouth was quite expressionless, curving neither up nor down, but his eyes were dark and hot with a mature hatred. They were half closed, but their eloquence smouldered through the lashes as he watched the figure on the barrel lean forward precariously. "Now listen well," continued the voice. "I'll tell you exactly who I am, and then I'll sing to you a song, and you will know who's singing to you, my ghastly little ineffectual fillets." "A song! A song!" came the shrill chorus. "Firstly," said the chief chef, leaning forward and dropping each confidential word like a cannonball smeared with syrup. "Firstly, I am none other than Abiathar Swelter, which means, for you would not know, that I am the symbol of both excellence and plenty. I am the father of excellence and plenty. Who did I say I was?" "Abiathar Swelter!" came the scream. The chef leaned back on his swollen legs and drew the corners of his mouth down until they lost themselves among the shadows of his hot dewlaps. "Abiathar," he repeated slowly, stressing the central A. "Abiathar. What did I say my name was?" "Abiathar!" came the scream again. "That's right, Abiathar. Are you listening, my pretty vermin? Are you listening?" The apprentices gave him to understand that they were listening very hard. Before the chef continued, he applied himself to the bottle once again. This time he held the glass neck between his teeth, and tilting his head back until the bottle was vertical, drained it and spat it out over the heads of the fascinated throng. The sound of black glass smashing on the flagstones was drowned in screams of approval. "Food," said Swelter, "is celestial, and drink is most entrancing. Such flowers of flatulence, my gaseous buds. Come closer in, steal in, and I will sing. I will lift my sweetest heart into the rafters. I will sing to you a song, an old song." It ran out. The live video ran out. So we shall read the last 2 pages until this chapter finished, and then we shall end. It was impossible for the apprentices to force themselves any closer to the chef, but they struggled and shouted for the soul, and turned their glistening faces upwards. "Oh, what a pleasant little lot of joints you are," said Swelter, peering at them and wiping his hands up and down his fat hips. "What a very drippy lot of little joints. Oh, yes, you are. But so underdone. Listen, Cox, I'll twist your grandma so sweetly in their graves. We'll make them turn, my dears. We'll make them turn, and what a turn for them, my own, and for the worms that nibble. Where's Steerpike?" "Steerpike! Steerpike!" yelled the youths, the ones in front twisting their heads and standing up on their toes, the ones in the rear craning forward and peering about them. "Steerpike! He's here somewhere, sir. Oh, there he is, sir. There, behind the pillar." "Silence!" bellowed the chef, turning his gourd of a head in the direction of the pointed hands as the high-shouldered boy was pushed forward. Here he is, sir." The boy, Steerpike, looked impossibly small as he stood beneath the monstrous monument. "I shall sing to you, Steerpike, to you," whispered the cook, reeling and supporting himself with one hand against the stone pillar that was glistening with condensed heat, little trickles of moisture moving down its fluted sides. "To you, the newcomer, the blue mummer and slug of summer. To you, the hideous and insidious, appallingly cretinous goat in a house of stenches." The apprentices rocked with joy. "To you, and only to you, my core of curdled cat bile. To you alone. So hearken, diligentiums. Are you hearkening? Are you all listening for how this goes? My song of 100 years ago, my plaintively most melancholic song." Swelter seemed to forget he was about to sing, and after wiping the sweat from his hands on the head of a youth below him, peered for Steerpike again. "And why to you, my ray of addled sunshine? Why to you alone? Taking it for granted, my dear little Steerpike, taking it for more than most granted, that you, a creature of less consequence than a stoat's shit, are so far removed from anything approaching nature. Yet tell me more rather. Don't tell me why your ears, which must originally have been designed for fly papers, are for some reason but unknown to yourself, kept immodestly unfurled. Why do you propose to do next in this matter? You move here and there on your measly little legs. I've seen it. You breathe all over my kitchen. You look at things with your insolent animal eyes. I've seen you doing it. I've seen you look at me. You're looking at me now, Steerpike, my impatient lovebird. What does it all mean? Why should I sing for you?" Swelter leaned back, seemed to be considering his own question a moment as he wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his forearm, but he waited for no reply, and flung his pendulant arms out sideways, and somewhere on the orbit of an immense arc, something or other gave way. Steerpike was not drunk. As he stood below Mr. Swelter, he had nothing but contempt for the man who yesterday had struck him across the head. He could do nothing, however, except stay where he was, prodded and nudged from behind by the excited minions, and wait. The voice recurred from above. "It is a song, Master Buck, to an imaginary monster, just like yourself, if only you were a trifle bigger and more monstrous still. It is a song to a half-hearted monster, so listen most fixedly, my pretty wart. Closer. Can't you come a little closer to my dirgiest masterpiece?" The wine was beginning to redouble its subversive activity in the chef's brain. He was now supporting himself almost the whole of the while against the sweating pillar and sagging hideously. Steerpike stared up at him from under his high, bony brow. The cook's eyes were protruding like bloodshot bubbles. One arm hung a dead weight down from the fluted surface of the support. The enormous area of face had fallen loose. It glistened like a jelly. A hole appeared in the face. Out of it came a voice that had suddenly become weaker. "I'm Swelter," it repeated. "The great chef, Abiather Swelter, cook to his lordship, boardship, and all sorts of other things, and ships that sail on slippery seas. Abiather Swelter, man and boy and girls and ribbons and kittens. 40 years of cold and sunny and money, thick and hairy. I'm a fairy, I'm a songster. Listen well." Mr. Swelter lowered his head downwards over his wine-rattled breast, without moving his shoulders, and made an effort to see whether his audience was sufficiently keyed up for his opening chords, but he could make out nothing below him. Of the little sea of faces he had alluded to. For this little sea had now become practically obliterated from him by a swimming mist. "Are you listening?" "The song! Yes, the song!" Swelter lowered his head yet again into the hot spindrift, and then held up his right hand weakly. He made one feeble effort to heave himself away from the pillar and deliver his verses at a more imposing angle, but incapable of mustering the strength, he sank back, and then, as a vast inane smile opened on the lower half of his face, and as Mr. Flay watched him, his hard little mouth twisted downwards, the chef began gradually to curl in upon himself as though folding himself up for death. The kitchen had become silent as a hot tomb. At last, through the silence, a weak, gurgling sound began to percolate. But whether it was the first verse of the long-awaited poem, no one could tell, for the chef, like a galleon, lurched in his anchorage. The great ship's canvas sagged and crumpled, and then suddenly an enormousness foundered and sank. There was a sound of something spreading, as an area of 7 flagstones became hidden from view beneath a cataclysmic mass of wine-drenched blubber. And that, for tonight, is where we will end. Thank you very much.